Debbie mentioned that I had preached here a long time ago, but more recently I was here on May 15th, the week that Art Haywood was speaking, and I was here to make an announcement and to thank you all for your support of heeding God's call to end gun violence. So it seems like a very short time since I've been in this beautiful, historic sanctuary, and yet I've been struck of all that has happened since May 15th. So since May 15th, Orlando happened, the largest mass shooting in our country's history, with 49 people killed in a gay nightclub. The following week, we observed the first anniversary of the shooting at Charleston, South Carolina, in Mother Emanuel Church, in which 9 people, including the pastor, were killed during a Bible study, and 5 survived. Since May 15th, in Philadelphia, 23 people who were alive when I was last here are now gone because of gun violence. And of those 23, 22 were African American, 1 Latino. And of those 23, 21 were men, 1 woman, and 1, this past week, a 4-year-old girl. Since May 15th, you have suffered your own trauma in the loss of Effie, whom I didn't know, but have heard and can feel from your love of her what a special person she was. I spoke for a long time with Reverend Kent this past week and said, look, I can come back and talk about gun violence at another time if this is not the best time. And he instead said, no, this is the right time. We want you to be here. And Liz, Effie's mother, has said, please go ahead at this moment. So I am particularly honored to enter this sacred space and sacred moment in your congregation's life. I'm speaking today about God and guns, something that we wouldn't think goes together, but intuitively we see in our culture gets all mixed up together. And in fact, I'm currently doing research on God and guns, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. In 2008, Barack Obama said in rural Pennsylvania that this was a population that was clinging to their religion and their guns. He was deeply criticized for that comment as being insulting, but it also rung true. We knew that God and guns kind of get mixed up together, but how does that happen? And is it true only for white working class people he was referring to? Religion is, in fact, what sociologists call an ambiguous variable. It can go either way. It can encourage gun ownership, and it can discourage it. So look at the text that I read today from Matthew. Those who are pro-gun love to point out, and have pointed out to me, and I've been doing many, many interviews, that Jesus' disciples were armed. They had swords. And in fact, earlier in the chapter, Jesus says, when you go on the road for me, get a sword. And yet, when one uses it against his enemy, he says, put that away, because those who live by the sword will die by the sword. We're in a time when there's a lot of religious switching going on. I'm sure there are a lot of cradle Unitarians here, and maybe people whose journey has come through other faith traditions. Sociologists of religion like to call this a time of post-denominationalism. And yet, when you look at statistics of how people believe, what their patterns of gun ownership are, and their beliefs about gun laws, it's absolutely distinct among religious groups. So, for example, about 40% of American households have guns, about 40%. And actually, that seems to be dropping even as the number of guns is going up. So obviously, fewer households. The average gun-owning household has 8 guns now. But of these, I'm visualizing my graphs here, so I'm a true sociologist. I dream in pie charts and things. But about 40% of American households own guns. Among white evangelical Protestants and white mainline Protestants, that would be Presbyterians, Lutherans, Episcopalians, it's higher, much higher, like 60%. Among African American Christians, Jews, Muslims, and Latino Catholics, it is about half the rate, far lower. And this is played out in terms of how people feel about changes in gun laws. In other words, those groups who are most at risk in our society, Jews and Muslims and Latinos and African Americans, at least in their faith groups, are the least likely to turn toward guns for protection, which is interesting since protection is the number one, and self-defense the number one reason people give now for acquiring firearms. So why? Why is this? So there's a bunch of research about those people who are over. And there's one study out, please don't glaze over, I'm not going to go all professorial on you, but there's an interesting study about the gun culture from Baylor University. And they did a survey among white men in the South, and they asked them about things that would create economic uncertainty and vulnerability and despair. So loss of a job, loss of a home through foreclosure, a number of things. And they put these together as an index of economic despair. Then they asked those who were gun owners how their guns made them feel. And they had a whole spectrum of feelings from they make me feel safer to they make me feel powerful and in charge. And they found that the higher the level of economic despair climbed, the higher the level of gun empowerment. In other words, those who were feeling vulnerable in loss and fear of loss, it was leading them to a reliance on weapons. It's really poignant, too, to consider that gun suicides are increasing. I'm so sorry to hear about your friend. And in that, dark night of the soul, if there is a gun handy, it is lethal and unforgiving. And the group that is most likely to turn to guns in those moments and commit suicide are the same white male who are feeling this loss and vulnerability. There are some churches I have been to that encourage gun ownership, that have raffles of weapons as fundraisers, who have 2A Sundays, Second Amendment Sundays, or open carry Sundays, where people are encouraged to wear their guns openly in coming to church. And the kind of theology around this is we have a sacred right to arm ourselves. In fact, I have interviewed some of these folks who sincerely feel they are called by God. God calls them to carry guns as protectors of their family and their community. At this time, I'm particularly focusing on African American Christians. So I'm not going to talk about Muslims and Jews and Latinos, but African American believers have very different patterns. Now, of course, among the urban poor, African American men are most likely to have access to illegal guns and by far are disproportionately represented among the victims of gun violence. And their deaths are in the Inquirer, usually on page 2 or 3 of the local section in a sidebar. They are not front page news. But among African American churchgoers, there is a much lower rate of gun ownership. Now, in some interviews, folks have said to me, "Oh, owning guns is a white thing. We can't afford it." When I've asked them, why do you think this is? African American believers are buying guns at about half the rate as the general population. We can't afford it. But then going deeper, there's a complicated history with slavery and this fear of the dominant white culture of an armed insurrection by African Americans. So many African Americans would say, we don't want to in any way appear threatening. But then probing deeper, there are even deeper theological reasons of fundamental belief in a security that transcends physical safety. And God for them is this security. The angels of God will surround them, but not necessarily protecting them from physical danger, but grounding them in a deeper eternal security. These communities take Jesus' call to love, forgiveness, and nonviolence to heart and have incorporated the teachings of Martin Luther King in his interpretation of this. As some of you might know, Dr. King had been a gun owner as a young pastor when he went to Jim Crow South in the 50s to take on his prestigious pulpit before the Montgomery bus boycott. He felt threatened. He had little kids and he had some weapons in the house. And yet, as he got involved in social change and he started seeing the power of nonviolence, and after his house was bombed, he disarmed and encouraged all of his followers to disarm. To live by the sword, he taught, would be to die by the sword. We would have the same fate. It is the power of love and not steel that will transform our society. Last week, I went to Charleston for the weekend of commemoration of that tragic event just a year ago. And I did feel then as now as if I were on sacred, holy ground. There were many events and many types of events commemorating the 9 lives lost and the 5 survivors. They always lift them up as well. It was a weekend filled with great preaching and speakers, choirs, symbolic rituals, planting of trees, releasing of doves. It was a weekend of tears and of celebration. And not just in the church, Mother Emanuel itself, but in the whole city of Charleston was engaged in this. And so I was listening for themes in not only what was being spoken publicly, but in individual conversation. And one thing that kept coming up over and over was June 17th, 2015 changed me, or changed us. So I was interested in how that happens. I was aware that the gun manufacturers, after Charleston, started a subtle marketing campaign in black churches. One said openly, if Reverend Pinckney had been armed, this would not have happened. If he had only been armed and brought a gun to his Bible study. But more subtly, talking to clergy and to churches about getting armed guards, encouraging members to come carrying weapons. So I was interested in how Mother Emanuel was responding to this. And I was shocked as I easily moved in and through the church, through that space where the horrible shooting had taken place. There were a few police officers outside on the street. There were no armed guards. There was no one checking purses. There were no metal detectors, but there were a lot of security cameras. So they had really increased their security through surveillance. But they had consciously made the difficult choice not to live by the gun, even though they had died by the gun. Another change that I saw that people spoke about was how their grief had led them to open their arms and embrace others who were suffering. So the week before the celebration, Reverend Dr. Betty Dees Clark, the new pastor, had been invited to go to the White House to be honored by Michelle Obama. I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? And instead, Orlando had just happened, and she went to Orlando just to be with the victims and their families, to hold them, to pray with them, and to offer support. And she came back to her church and said, I was in Orlando last week, and I didn't see gender, I didn't see ethnicity, I didn't see sexual orientation. I saw people suffering, people whom God loves. And for a traditional conservative Baptist church in the South, this is huge. This is a huge transformation to be embracing those from the LGBT community. And most spoke of the deep bond they felt with those in Orlando and found in their grief that it was also the source of empathy. One speaker from who was an editor of a religious journal made this observation. He said, trauma can lead people to become more shallow and brittle, or it can lead people to become deeper. And he said, there is no one I've heard or talked to here that is not deeper. And I heard this depth as the members of Mother Emanuel spoke about forgiveness. This forgiveness echoed in from the words of Martin Luther King and from Jesus. Not a simple, easy, happy face forgiveness, but for them, forgiving and loving their enemy has been hard work. But for them, I heard stories that their personal transformation was a microcosm of the social transformation that they sought. Martin Luther King's words are deeply ingrained and often repeated. I experienced too, not just this spiritual reality, but a deep resolve and depth that we seldom see in our society. People moved from memorializing those who were lost and who had been suffered to courageous witness and action, working for the ban, calling for a ban on assault weapons and limits on those crazy magazine clips that are huge, for expanded background checks. These in the same statements, coming out of grief, but a resolve to change. I'm often asked how it is I can keep going working on this issue, how any of us can keep going working on this issue. And my first response is, how can we not? What will happen if we stop working for gun violence prevention? Our country has been in a kind of spiritual malaise where we have year after year seeing these numbing numbers come in, 30,000 plus killed by guns. We have developed this kind of spiritual malaise which accepts what should be unacceptable. This should be outrageous. This should be mobilizing. We owe it not only to ourselves and our children, but also to all those voices who have been silenced by guns. But on a more positive note, I keep going because I have hope. Since Sandy Hook, there has been a groundswell of public awareness and activism at the local level. Art Haywood's election, one expression of that. No, we haven't gotten the big gun control law that we would all like to see, but there are more members of gun violence prevention organizations than there are in the NRA. And the public is increasingly supportive of common sense gun laws. 90% support the no-fly, no-buy prohibition against selling guns to those on the terrorist watch list. That should be a no-brainer. So that has been a huge change, which gives us hope. Also, since May 15th and the horrific events, we have seen Senator Chris Murphy filibuster in the Senate when attempts to pass laws were blocked, and he filibustered. And then the next week, of course, this unprecedented sit-in in Congress, which ironically happened when our congressperson was convicted of fraud, but other Democrats sitting in and taking this moral stance. I get hope from places like Charleston, and in Charleston particularly, where their grief is not a weight that holds them in the past of mourning, but their grief has become a kind of rocket fuel in working for change. And I get hope from congregations like yours, and particularly from yours, not only because you have given money and support and participated in Heeding God's Call and other events for gun violence prevention, but that particularly in this week of your sorrow, you're looking outward and you're looking forward and saying, what can we do? What can we do? So thank you for inviting me this morning and all that you are doing to build peace. I am standing, in fact, on sacred ground. Thank you.